Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you're up this week.
Yes, sir.
What are you bringing to the table today?
So I have brought our April book to the table for us to talk about today.
All
Put
right.
some air horns here. That's like, I don't think he's ready. There he is. This was a great book. The book is called Abolition, Politics, Practices, Promises, Volume 1. And it is by the incomparable Dr. Angela Davis. And as I mentioned last week, the book is the first of 2 new volumes being released. Though I should mention, I tried to Google when we can expect Volume 2, and I couldn't find it. So we'll see what happens. Hopefully it's on its way. But this book brings together a collection of Angela Davis's writings and work over the years that are directly focused on abolition. And so the book is broken up into several parts, and each of those parts has a few chapters in them. So part 1 of this book is titled Capitalism, Democracy, and the Prison. Part 2 is called Slavery and the U.S. Prison, Genealogical Connections. Part 3 is titled Disarticulating Crime and Punishment, Emerging Abolitionist Frameworks. Part 4 is Rethinking Incarceration, Identifying the Prison Industrial Complex. And then lastly, part 5 is titled Incarcerated Women, the Netherlands, the United States, and Cuba. And so I think in the most simplest of descriptions and introductions of this book that I can offer, because it's just amazing. Throughout the book, there is a lot of incredible analysis of the history of the prison industrial complex across the globe, the lived experiences of incarcerated women, as well as the role of women in the prison system and in the fight for abolition, and the lessons that have been learned from some of the organizing that has taken place both inside the prison and outside of prisons. And all of that analysis is, I think, laser focused on the idea that the prison, and I'd certainly broaden that to include the full prison industrial complex, has been and will always be a devastatingly insufficient solution to public safety and to rehabilitation. And in actuality, the polar opposite of those things. So I don't think that description does this book justice, but I'm so excited. I've been itching to get to this table and talk to you about this book because there's just so much in it. There's so much that I learned from Dr. Davis and the researchers she worked with, and the folks she cited throughout this book, and the people that they interviewed in these essays. And so, I'm excited. Let's get into it. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, this is a great book. I really appreciated it, reading through it, and it lays out a lot of the issues, as you said, of prisons and the way that prisons began as sites. They began as sites for surveillance and rehabilitation.
Right.
And those grew out of a version of reform that would be more humane than the corporal punishment that was the norm at the time, the status quo at the time. So this was a way to be more humane.
Interestingly.
Yeah. And, Dr. Davis then goes on to illustrate this change here in chapter 6, which is changing attitudes toward crime and punishment. So she says, prior to the Enlightenment, before the individual was perceived as a bearer of formal rights and liberties, the deprivation of rights and liberties through imprisonment could not be understood as punishment. The prison sentence as punishment invokes the abstraction of time in a way that resonates with the role of labor time as the basis for computing commodity value. Marxist theorists of punishment have noted that the historical period during which the commodity form arose is the same one in which the penitentiary emerges as the paradigmatic mode of punishment.
Wow.
And so there's a lot in that.
Yes.
And there's a lot of Marxist philosophy in that and different things to pull apart. But we can see in this how our collective understanding of punishment evolved to incorporate new ideas about rights and liberties, and which means it can continue to evolve.
Yes.
And we don't have to be stuck in the way that it is now. And we can potentially find a new way to shift to a process of accountability that is grounded in consequences instead of punishment.
I love that. Yeah, you're right. There's a lot in there, but I think that in particular is a great takeaway from her analysis there. The other thing that quote actually makes me think about is just how reforms aren't a viable measure or solution when it comes to the prison industrial complex. Reforms have been implemented throughout history, and yet here we are, right? And so, yeah, that was great. It's funny, that actually really connects well to some of the analysis in chapter 2 of the book. So I'm taking it back a little bit, where Dr. Davis talks about the rise of the prison system in America and its connections to inequality. So she says, quote, "In the United States, the project of instituting imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment was historically linked to the post-revolutionary metamorphosis of government and society during the late 1700s and the early 1800s. The rise of the penitentiary in the new United States of America was viewed simultaneously as dramatic evidence of democratization and as a symptom of unacknowledged racial, gender, and class inequalities embedded in the very structure of the new democracy. Imprisonment as punishment meant, on the one hand, that denial of liberty provided negative proof of the emergence of liberty as the social standard. The denial of liberty was, so to speak, the exception that proved the rule. On the other hand, there were those who argued that, I'm quoting scholar Adam J. Hirsch, quote, "liberty was too precious a treasure to confiscate for a minor or even major criminal infraction." And so what stands out to me here is the fact that the prison industrial complex has always been connected to the embedded or the baked in inequalities of our society and our democracy, right? And so, to your point earlier, we have to fight for abolition of this kind of punishment and the systems and the structures that really stand up the prison industrial complex.
Yeah, and I think that quote from chapter 2 and that's what I talked about from chapter 6. They both point to the way that we took people's liberty as a form of punishment, and I'll connect back to this I think in a little bit. And that's an important point because it shows how we evolved in terms of our thinking on what punishment could be. Because before, it had to be something taken out on the body. Right. It had to be physical stocks, like being put in the stocks, or even being executed. Those were the choices. And so there is a way that you see that this is more humane. But it's also grounded in, you have these rights and now you don't because you messed up according to the rights that we say that you should or shouldn't have. And so there's something to be said about that too, that it is an evolution, but it's an evolution that's in the same sort of vein of punishment. It's it just feels a little bit nicer. It's a little bit kinder, which ties into some of the ways that we've talked about prison reform over the last several decades is, we need to make sure that it's a nicer cage. We don't need a nicer cage. What if we figured out some other form of addressing harm in communities than cages?
Absolutely. Right. And really, I think the word nicer or more humane here is just woefully insufficient and wrong, right? When we're talking about denying people their liberty. I mean, that's just not it. And so speaking of sort of the ways that things evolved, early on in the book, Dr. Davis is writing about convict leasing, which was born in the wake of enslavement. The wake of the end of enslavement, I should say. And she's really critical of Frederick Douglass in this chapter, as he was relatively silent on this process that became really prominent across the South. That's right.
But Dr. Davis quotes Mary Church Terrell, who wrote an essay on convict leasing. So Terrell said, quote, "It is no exaggeration to say that in some respects the convict lease system, as it is operated in certain southern states, is less humane than was the bondage endured by slaves 50 years ago. For under the old regime, it was to the master's interest to clothe and shelter and feed his slaves properly, even if he were not moved to do so by considerations of mercy and humanity, because the death of a slave meant an actual loss in dollars and cents, whereas the death of a convict today involves no loss whatsoever, either to the lessee or to the state."
Right.
So we see how the prison was a reform away from corporal punishment.
Right.
It was, quote, "the penitentiary as an institution for the reformation of criminals." It was aimed at largely white men.
Right.
And so we know that these work gangs, these convict leasing processes were implemented in different ways based on race in the United States. And so race played a central role in how the prison has developed as a source of punishment and control of Black people and people of color in this country from the beginning.
From the beginning.
It was aligned with some of those Enlightenment reforms that aligned also with the ways that our system of chattel slavery collapsed and was abolished here in the country. And so then we had to find new ways to control those folks once then Reconstruction collapsed.
Right, absolutely. Well, that's brilliant.
And let me say, I mean, the federal government and state governments. And
yes.
Let's clarify who I mean by we.
Absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt.
No. I was going to say what stood out to me in the quote that you read there, and sort of just thinking about reforms. I mean, you said words like, we've been talking about humane. You said words like mercy and humanity. Yeah. I mean, it's just so fascinating, the language that was used to sort of analyze this and talk about these reforms. I mean, none of it is those words. Like, that is really, like, I just want to sort of name that it's kind of, it hits me in a place when I see words like that and I read words like that and thinking about reforms in prison and whatnot. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, from the very beginnings of prison and punishment systems, right, that has been the case, and it remains the case all the way to today. And so I appreciate sort of that analysis around the evolution, I should say, of the prison industrial complex and its effects on the control of Black people in this country. Another population that's discussed in this book is incarcerated women around the world. And I thought it felt to me one of the biggest parts of this book. The last part of the book entirely centers around Dr. Davis's work with her research partners to interview incarcerated women in the Netherlands, in Cuba, and here in the United States, I believe out in California. And I honestly felt like after I read it, I was like, we could spend an entire episode talking just about that last part and about their work with these, and and the findings that they wrote about of these interviews. But one of the biggest takeaways for me was a particular piece of her analysis and a sort of a through line of their work. So Dr. Davis says, one of the most revealing contradictions inherent in systems of punishment that rely primarily on incarceration is the degree to which they foster dependency and promote forms of institutionalization, both of which tend to ensure that once a prisoner is released, she is more likely to end up returning to prison. And then a little later on in that part, she says, quote, the fostering of dependency and institutionalization, a denial of agency on which philosophies of imprisonment are based, is especially detrimental to women, whose agency is denied in patriarchal social systems that subordinate women's needs to those of men and children. And so again, that to me was really highlighted as a through line of the interviews that they did with the incarcerated women in all of those countries, actually. And for me, reading about their stories and their lived experiences and the incredible analysis many of the women had about the prison system and where they were and what they were able to do and not do. And, we talked about liberties, that was a really profound takeaway for me from this book.
Yeah, it highlights the story of prison across the globe.
Across the globe, yes.
Because they interview people in different places and in different kinds of social structures and economic systems and found some pretty similar results.
Yes.
Different window dressings on what those prisons looked like, but ultimately pretty similar results from their interviews.
Absolutely.
Which is not to minimize the differences between how those prisoners are treated across the country, because there are profound differences between how prisoners are treated in the Netherlands and in the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was kind of wild to read about.
Yes.
Yeah.
But so throughout the book, Dr. Davis talks about the constructions of concepts that serve the purpose of further promoting the need for prisons.
Yeah.
And in this context, she's talking about how we construct an idea of criminality and a consistent fear of crime.
Okay.
So in chapter 5, she says, quote, The ideological reproduction of a fear of black people, whether economically or sexually grounded, is rapidly gravitating toward and being grounded in a fear of crime. A question to be raised in this context is whether and how the increasing fear of crime, this ideologically produced fear of crime, serves to render racism simultaneously more invisible and more virulent.
Oh, yes.
She connects back to this point in a different way later on in the book, where she's discussing how this idea of constructed fear of black people and crime eats up all of our collective attention. So she says in chapter 6, quote, "Moreover, the construction of a class and or race-inflected criminal as the enemy and as a deserving target of often violent punishment, a phenomenon that can result in the false imprisonment of innocent people, diverts attention from social problems such as poverty, homelessness, deteriorating education and healthcare, drug use, thereby siphoning off the collective energy needed to solve them."
Wow.
So we know that this fear is constructed, it's manufactured, and it's amplified beyond the reality of the actual crimes that are committed and the statistics that we know in terms of what's actually happening. And it's a convenient distraction for our politicians to use to avoid things like healthcare, education, or immigration, or actually addressing poverty.
Yes.
They can focus in on this fear, and we'll all be kind of okay with it because we also have this fear.
Yes.
And so, it's also a double-edged sword. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy again. They say that we need to address this because it's a big deal, and a lot of my constituents are afraid about it, which then means that, is this also something I should be afraid about? It's reinforcing, right?
Yes.
It's a vicious cycle of fear-mongering and then generating responses to the fear-mongering, which then create more fear-mongering.
Absolutely. Well, one of the other things that makes me think about is just this idea that, like, how that happens. And we've talked about how communities are portrayed in mass media and how it's in our children's books. It is baked in from the beginning to our lived experiences. And so you talk about sort of stoking that fear and laying the foundation for that. And it's everywhere. And I think about what's happening now with this administration with, immigration. You mentioned immigration too, that those are bad people and they all must be bad. And so they all deserve this, right? Like, it is really perpetuating those ideologies that just aren't true and is deflecting from the true problems and the ills of our society. I love that point.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we could talk forever about this book. I would love to, actually, but let's transition over to application here. How does this incredible book and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives and work? There's, as you can imagine, literally so much in the way of application to take from this book. It was really overwhelming to think about, like, what do I want to bring? What's going to be the best thing? I want to beat you. No. I want to highlight something from the preface of this book as my application, because to me, it was the epitome of why abolition is absolutely necessary. And specifically here, Angela Davis means abolition in the truest sense and definition of that word and the work. And so she says, quote, "As long as racial capitalism dictates exploitative economic scenarios around the world, the very conditions that give rise to and enforce retributive models of legality will continue to assert the permanence of racist-inspired carceral structures. It is thus entirely contradictory to call for the abolition of prisons and police and to engage in practices that leave capitalist democracy and indeed capitalism itself intact. Abolition is a mandate to create new social, economic, and political conditions that will render carceral punishment obsolete. It is a mandate for revolution." Mm-hmm. And so this is the call for and the rationale for full stop abolition in my eyes. The point here is that we can't abolish prisons or police and leave the conditions that allow capitalism to thrive in place, because those capitalist conditions work to lead us back to our reliance on the prison industrial complex. And I think there's also broader applicability there beyond this example of capitalist democracy, right? Like, this applies to our white supremacist, sexist, racist, patriarchal systems and structures and thinking beyond that. I really appreciated her push there. And so I wanted to sort of name that as my application. What about you?
Yeah, I think that that's a great point. I think that, early on in the book, at one point, she's really tying together how prisons, how policing really evolved in this country. We talked about this a little bit.
Yes.
From liberal democracy. And
Yes.
the points I was making earlier tie into those conceptions of what liberty is. And the revocation of that liberty as form of punishment is intricately tied into what a democracy is.
Yes.
And what this version of a democracy is as a capitalist democracy.
Right.
And so it's hard. You can't necessarily parse them all out. There's a whole new way we've got to think about how to do things.
Imagine it and do it. Absolutely.
Yeah. So my application comes from a point made in the Dutch Prisoners' Rights Handbook that she quotes from as part of the research study that she did in the Netherlands. So that handbook says, quote, "Many people in prison are serving sentences. They are in prison as punishment, but not for punishment. The penalty consists in loss of liberty. The circumstances of imprisonment should not, therefore, be used as an additional punishment." And I think this is a crucial point for the rights of prisoners.
Yes.
This is necessary for all prisons around the world, and there should not be additional torture or discomfort or punishment of any kind beyond the loss of liberty,
100%.
given the context that we exist in.
Yep.
And because I'm just talking about what should be happening right now. Abolitionists, as we've talked about, are envisioning a world beyond prisons, beyond punishment, that gives us the opportunity to address harm in communities rather than through authority. It's harm with, instead of saying you did something wrong, you did something bad, and this is how you're going to pay for it. But to get there, we have to whittle away at the power that prisons have, and giving prisoners clear, actionable rights like this is one of the ways to get there.
Yes.
And we see examples now constantly of how people don't have these rights, and that the punishment is your loss of liberty, and then whatever extra stuff we can add on top of that. And so seeing some of these images from the prison in El Salvador, from other prisons around the world, you can see that it's not just about the loss of liberty. There's additional elements of humiliation. I mean, think about the pictures of U.S. soldiers humiliating captives in Iraq.
Yeah.
The point is the loss of liberty. The point is the sentence. And that's supposed to be it. That's not how it happens, which I think is another argument for me for abolition, is that prisons haven't operated in the way that they should be operating. And I don't think any amount of reform will get us to a place where that's going to work appropriately.
Yeah.
And then we also have to think about what appropriately means.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, and it's sad that we're at the point that we're at, but I think those images from El Salvador, images like it that we've seen, I mean, hopefully it opens folks' eyes to that this isn't it. And you're right, it absolutely is more than just the loss of liberty there. It is the torture, it is the harm, it is the degradation, it is all the inhumane conditions and treatment. And it is beyond time that we abolish it all. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Great application there, my friend. All right, let's talk about homework. How do we want to continue our learning and unlearning work once we leave the table today? I want to give this book another sort of read through before I move on to the next one, because there's just so much great content in it. And I was really excited to think about what I wanted to talk about today. And so I want to just see what more I can continue to learn from this book. There are also so many great citations and quotes and folks featured in this book that I want to look into. She quotes folks like Derek Bell, Frederick Douglass, Cheryl Harris, Kimberly Crenshaw, Cornel West, Ruth Wilson Gilmore. I mean, the list goes on and on. And so there's certainly a lot of homework there.
Yeah.
What about you?
Well, I want to go back and read Mary Church Terrell's essay that I referenced earlier.
Yes.
It's called Peonage in the United States that I referenced. It's from 1907, and it still feels very connected to the situation we find ourselves in today, where we're shipping immigrants to a prison in El Salvador.
Right.
So she closes her piece by saying, quote, "The politician declares that the Negro is unfit for citizenship and violently snatches from his rights. The planter declares the Negro is lazy and forces him into involuntary servitude contrary to the law. Each tyrant employs the same process of reasoning to justify his course." So I think in this, we see the echoes of creating narratives about people and attaching criminality to them and creating fear and using that manufactured fear to determine how those people should be treated, regardless of the laws, the what you claim are people's rights.
Boy, for some reason that quote just stirred up some anger for me. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. No, that would be a great essay to read. I love that. Very good. All right, well, folks, definitely check this book out. It is incredible and absolutely worth your time. But we're going to move on here. Aaron, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in, let me say it, our 199th episode? Yeah, he was ready that time.
Well, we'll do some more air horns for the 200th.
Absolutely.
But for 199, I'm bringing an essay by Mariame Kaba that was published by Interrupting Criminalization just a few weeks ago. It's called Criminalizing Librarians, Threats and Realities, and this is a description from the website. In this essay, Mariame Kaba walks readers through the history of assaults on librarians, including librarians persecuted during Red Scares and the violence against activists desegregating libraries during the Civil Rights Movement, contemporary threats and examples of library workers pushing back as we continue the long haul of protecting our libraries and the people who work in them. And so I'm excited to read this and talk about it next week because I think libraries are one of our few places that are democratically held spaces of knowledge and give people access to knowledge that otherwise is hard to get access to if you don't have money to buy books or to pay for every documentary you want to watch or to listen to music. They have access to all of these things and a lot more now, and it's all accessible to people in a variety of ways. And I think that protecting access to that knowledge in an uncensored manner and thereby understanding how librarians have been targeted to take away that access to knowledge from us is really important. So I'm excited, one, to read this and excited that Mariame Kaba wrote this essay about that.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit about what you were going to bring right before we started recording, and you failed to mention that it was by Mariame Kaba. So that it makes me even more excited about this. But yeah, I think in addition to them being democratic spaces, I would even argue that they're sacred spaces. And so we must protect our libraries. And I'm excited about the lens here of talking about librarians and the workers, the library staff. So yeah, very excited. Looking forward to that one. All right, folks. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.